We're about to get started. Cory Hughes, he's been on many podcasts. He hosts a few podcasts. He's written a book, which he has several copies of. You all better buy it tonight. We're talking about RFK and JFK. So give it up for Cory Hughes.
Is this thing on? All right. Why do I feel like a comedian all of a sudden? My name's Cory Hughes. I'm a full-time Kennedy researcher. I've been on Kennedy since July of 2018. I think that's 7 years at this point. It is still the one thing that gets me out of bed in the morning, and it is the last thing I think about before I go to bed every night. I just finished a second book yesterday, actually. It's in the proofreading phase. Hopefully it'll be out in the next couple days, called Lee Harvey Oswald in Black and White, Volume 1. It's the first of a 4-volume set on the life of Lee Harvey Oswald. So recently there's been a lot of talk in the news about the Kennedy assassination and files and the allure that the government is actually going to confess to us after all these years that they murdered John F. Kennedy. How many people here actually believe that the documents are ever going to show that the government killed Kennedy? Yeah, nobody, yeah. You're right. What I'm going to tell you tonight is that we don't need any more documents. All of the documents that we already have, of the 5 million plus, out of those 5 million pages of documents, you will find amongst them a couple hundred pages that tell the real tale. And the real tale starts in New Orleans. Well, that's what we'll focus on tonight for the most part. Because when I talk about Kennedy, everyone wants to know who the shooters were. That's always the big question. And here we are 60 years into not knowing. There have been thousands of books written, and none of them give you any more answers than you had before you read the book. Very frustrating. How many books out there are called Kennedy Assassination Solved, and yet you didn't get any answers from reading it? The assassination, if you want to talk about big picture, started way before Kennedy ever was elected. And when I say that, I mean Kennedy's ideology. He was, at the time, basically, by the majority right-wing population of America, considered to be a communist, just because he wanted to be friendly with Khrushchev. He wanted to denuclearize the world, and I think that was a great goal at the time. However, you have elements within the CIA, and you have elements within the United States Mafia, and you have elements within the Israeli Mossad, which felt that Kennedy's actions were too great of change for the day. In particular, let's talk about Israel. You know, when I go and I give a talk or I do a podcast, very often I'm called an anti-Semite, which is kind of hilarious because I'm just a historian and I just report the facts. But the facts tell me that the person who greenlit the assassination was David Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel. In May of 1963, there was a series of letters exchanged between Kennedy and David Ben-Gurion, which ultimately resulted in Ben-Gurion stepping down. He was replaced by Levi Eshkol. Kennedy basically wanted to get inspectors into the Dimona nuclear reactor, which everyone in the world knew about because Time magazine did an expose on it in 1960. Starting in 1960, from the minute, or 61, when Kennedy really got into office, his main priority was Israel and the bomb, and getting inspectors into Dimona, denuclearizing the world, and ultimately, that is what got him killed. Now, to understand that, you have to understand that the relationships between the Israelis and the United States Mafia go back to 1945, 1946. In 1946, David Ben-Gurion sends a guy named Reuven Daphne. He was an emissary of the Haganah, which was a pre-Israeli terrorist organization. And he meets with Bugsy Siegel in Los Angeles. This kicked off a lifelong relationship between the United States Mafia, which was not run by Italians. It was run by Meyer Lansky, who was a Polish Jew. The relationship between the Jews and the Italians was one of the Italians ran the local mafia, and the Jews ran the international syndicate. Meyer Lansky formed relationships with everybody, the Triad, you name it, the Corsican Mafia. He built the international drug trade, really going back before the CIA. And it was his relationships with a guy named Tibor Rosenbaum and a bank called the Banque de Crédit International, which facilitated all of the drug dealing, the money laundering, and it also facilitated all of Israel's international transactions for the first 2 or 3 years. Understanding the relationships between the Israelis, the mafia, and the CIA, and from the CIA you have other branches of government that were involved, Defense Intelligence Agency, Secret Service. But those 3 organizations are one organization in 1963. After Reuven Daphne meets with Bugsy Siegel and forms that relationship, David Ben-Gurion formed a personal relationship with Meyer Lansky. And from 46 all the way through the mid-60s, the CIA used people like David Ferry, Gordon Novell, Sergei Arkacha, people who were connected to the Kennedy assassination, to break into numerous bunkers and armories across the country to steal our World War II surplus. This would go down to become known as the Sonborn Institute. Rudolph Sonborn was a rich oil guy, American, traitor to his country, partnered with Ben-Gurion to form the Sonborn Institute. That operation lasted way past Kennedy's death. Now, all of those armory break-ins were always attributed to funding of anti-Castro Cuban operations, which is one of the biggest red herrings in all of the Kennedy assassination research. All of the money and all of the arms that were supposed to go to the Cubans for their uprising against Castro, they never got there because all of them were deflected through a company called Interarmco in Virginia, run by the CIA, and sent to Israel to fight the Palestinians. So all of these actions from the 40s to the 60s leading up to the assassination of Kennedy, it kind of broadened my perspective on the 20th century. If you really want to understand the 20th century, you have to understand the story of the 20th century is the story of Israel. And it began in 1896 with Theodor Herzl and the birth of political Zionism in Basel, Switzerland, the first Zionist Congress, 1897. Regardless of what you're told in the zeitgeist today, the propaganda story that Zionism is it's for the Jewish people to have, be in control of their own destiny. That's a lie. Zionism is and has always been a plot to take over the world. And every single major event of the 20th century is directly connected to either the formation of Israel, the maintenance of Israel, or the promotion of the Greater Israel Project, which is exactly what we're seeing in the Middle East today. So I don't normally talk about Trump or the modern era because I feel like everything was lost with Kennedy. By 68, the world ended for me. Well, once you take out Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, the playing field was just wiped out. There was nothing left. There was no resistance left. I like to think Trump is some level of resistance, but he's proving not to be. So when you come to understand the story of the 20th century being the story of Israel, their involvement in the assassination itself becomes brutally obvious. The motivations become obvious. Dimona and their nuclear program, they felt was essential to their existence. It was a struggle with Kennedy for their own survival. That's how they saw it. Now, how does that connect to anybody in Dealey Plaza? So by my calculations, there were 9 people in place with rifles. They found no less than 6 rifles in Dealey Plaza that day. 3 Mausers, the Carcano, a Remington, a Johnson 303, and then they took an Enfield 303 off of Buell Frazier, who was the man who allegedly drove Oswald to work that day. But to connect them to the larger scale operation is actually rather fairly simple. There was a company called Permindex that never conducted any known business. It was a who's who of spooks and mafia and ex-Nazis and criminals of all sorts. On the board of directors of this company was Alan Dulles, James Angleton, Clay Shaw, who was the focus of the Jim Garrison trial, in 1967 in New Orleans, the only trial ever brought for the conspiracy to kill John Kennedy. The connection between all of these organizations, the Mafia, the CIA, the Mossad, is through Permindex. Permindex ran a sub-company called Centre Mondial Commercial, which was run out of Montreal, run by a guy named Louis Bloomfield. Louis Bloomfield happened to be a lawyer for Edmund de Rothschild, but I don't really get into Rothschild conspiracies personally. So once you have the money funneling down from Permindex to CMC, I look at Permindex as kind of like the oversight board. The order is greenlit from David Ben-Gurion. At the time of the assassination, 3 weeks before the assassination, Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, who would go on to be prime ministers of Israel, were kicking it in Los Angeles. That had become their second home base. You see, after the bombing of the King David Hotel in '46, they had to basically get the hell out of town, and they set up shop in Los Angeles. And so by 1963, you have, 10, 15 years of relationship between these, what were the pre-Israeli Zionists, who then became the Israelis, who you could now say in '63 are certainly Mossad. Another fact most people don't know, Yitzhak Rabin flew into Dallas the night before. It was written about in his wife's memoirs. So I can't place Shamir and Menachem Begin in Dealey Plaza. But from what I can tell, everyone was there. There was a somewhat degree of ritual to it. They all had to see for themselves. When you go through the photographs in Dealey Plaza, you'll clearly find David Morales, Ted Shackley, George Joannides, who's been in the news lately. But let me get back to connecting the shooters to the bigger picture. Through this company, Permindex, Clay Shaw is the main character of the story in New Orleans. Surrounding Clay Shaw is David Ferry and Sergio Arcacha, Emilio Santana. Names that pop up in the New Orleans story when you dig into it. A lot of the names are featured in the Oliver Stone film, JFK. I don't know if any of you have seen that. It's an excellent film. It is complete propaganda, but it is an excellent film nonetheless. I've probably seen it 20 times. It is this group in New Orleans that is largely responsible for the shooting itself. And we know this because of the testimony of a guy named Perry Russo during the trial of Clay Shaw. He tells a story about being at a party where he identifies Oswald and a couple Cubans and David Ferry and Clay Shaw. They're all there. They're talking about killing the president. Well, turns out it was never Oswald there. Oswald's a patsy. Oswald's not involved in any of the activities leading up to the assassination whatsoever. He was sitting in the movie theater eating popcorn, getting arrested, probably didn't even know the president was killed. But this New Orleans crew, the connection through Clay Shaw leads directly to Israel. And when you dig into the facts and circumstances surrounding what happened in Dealey Plaza that day, I can't even put Lee Harvey Oswald inside that building at all that day, at all on November 22nd. The entire story of Oswald falls apart from the jump. So the story goes, Buell Frazier gave Oswald a ride to work, and that Oswald walked in the back door carrying a package under his arm so that it fit neatly under his armpit. That story was debunked by a guy named Ed Shields, who testified to the HSCA, which is the House Committee on Assassinations in the 70s. That story never happened, that he got out of his car and there was nobody with him. He dropped off his rider at the front of the building. So that story goes away. Every interaction of Oswald inside the book depository that day either didn't happen, was an exaggeration, or a fabrication. And I'm sure most people here have heard about the Oswald on the second floor in the lunchroom drinking a Coke story. So allegedly Oswald couldn't have shot the president because he couldn't have made it down the stairs in 90 seconds to drink a Coke to be busted by Officer Baker and Roy Truly on the second floor. But that whole story never happened. It was a fabrication. That incident actually happened with the person wearing a light brown jacket, and it happened on the stairwell between the third and the fourth floor, and there was no Coke involved. The reason that they fabricated that entire story was to cover for the fact that they made an arrest at the exact same time in front of the book depository, an arrest of a man named Emilio Santana. Emilio Santana was one of two anti-Castro Cubans, along with Sergio Arcacha, who had been reported as on their way to Dallas to shoot the president on November 20th. November 20th, a woman named Rose Chermy she's kind of roughed up and thrown out of a bar. Cops get involved. They bring her to the hospital. On the way to the hospital, she tells Francis Fruge, lieutenant for the Louisiana State Police, they're on their way to Dallas and they're going to kill Kennedy. And nobody takes her seriously. She's strung out on heroin, probably drunk, definitely a prostitute. And back then, if you were a prostitute, you had no credibility. You know, like Jim Garrison, Kevin Costner said as Jim Garrison in the film, why is it that when a woman's a prostitute, she has to have bad eyesight? But she reports clearly that the two men with her were on their way to Dallas. And the reason I bring this up is because we already have all the information on this. When you go through all the documents that we currently have, you can piece together every single person in what I call the cast of characters. You can map out all their actions. You can tell who is important by the amount of documents missing on that person. Emilio Santana, shooter at the Daltex building. This I was able to put together by the descriptions of Oswald that were called out over the police radio, which didn't match Oswald at the time. But Emilio Santana, arrested clearly, and the photograph, Willis 10, shows his arrest. There's no video, but a still photograph shows a man being taken into custody and they're taking a rifle off of him. So when I say that we already have enough information to know exactly what happened, we do. I want to give you an example of recent news in regards to George Joannides. So George Joannides is a very important person. He was the head of psychological warfare for the CIA's JM Wave station, which is JM Wave was the largest CIA domestic station operating in America. It ran somewhere around 30,000 agents. And you know, the CIA is not supposed to operate in America. So completely illegal operation. The JM Wave station employed George Joannides, who in the summer of '63 was in New Orleans. We've already known he's been in New Orleans. We've known that for years. We recently find out that he used the alias of a man named Howard Gebler. Howard Gebler was connected to the Friends of Democratic Cuba, but so was a guy named David Atlee Phillips. So this has been all the big news lately on Kennedy. Like the CIA is telling us something. They're confirming their connections to Kennedy by telling us about George Joannides and how he used an alias and was connected to this group. But the problem with all of this stuff is that it's all red herrings. It doesn't matter at all. The group that they're talking about, the Friends of Democratic Cuba, was run by a guy named David Atlee Phillips who never made it to New Orleans. They put this stuff out as though it's meaningful news, but when you really dig into it, it means nothing. There is no connection whatsoever between George Joannides, Lee Harvey Oswald, or any of the operations going on in New Orleans. But that's not what the news would have you believe today. The news is attempting to do some kind of soft disclosure that the CIA was connected to Oswald, but they're doing it in a manner that is blatantly false and disprovable. So I don't trust anything in regards to any of the documents they've given us. The only document they've given us recently that has had anybody surprised was the fact that they had hid all the references to the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. That was redacted in the original documents, and that was unredacted. But once again, they tell us something we already know. So you have to be really dubious of everything they tell us. All these new documents that they're giving us are really worthless. When you go through, God, the last 4 or 5 releases going back to like 2017, probably 30,000 pages of documents, there's nothing in there. They fill it with stuff on Cuba, which is irrelevant, Mexico City, which is irrelevant, a lot of the Russia stuff, which might be relevant. I can't tell you yet. But in as far as the document releases and what they're telling us, they're completely worthless. Does anybody have any questions about anything before I talk about anything else?
You want to go straight to questions or
Oh, we can go to questions if you want. You go right ahead. I can elaborate on whatever from there.
go to questions?
Questions? Okay, I'll do the first question.
All right.
So I've seen a lot of talk online lately that a lot of people now believe that Jeffrey Epstein was probably backed by Mossad. I don't see the same level of talk that people think that JFK was killed by the Mossad.
Right.
Do you see that changing? And if that changes, what do you think might happen?
Well, the propaganda machine that would counter that information is already in full effect, right? We've seen the propaganda machine like crazy lately in regards to Israel as this sanctimonious state and whatnot. But I think that's a huge part of what they're hiding is relationships to Israel. When you really get into the mafia documents, the relationship between Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Mickey Cohen, I mean, all these big mobsters were Jews, and they all had direct relationships with the heads of Israel, you know. That, I think, is a lot of what they're hiding, because that information only comes out in a rare book here or there, you know. If you ask me, ultimately, Israel killed Kennedy and took over our country that day, and we've been an Israeli colony ever since. And that's why, no matter who gets into office, it's always about them. Everything has to go through AIPAC, you know? So they have their hands in everything. Every single horrific event of the 20th century, hell, and even COVID, it was all done by Israel, 100%. So World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, God, I could go on and on. All instigated by them. COVID-19 was manufactured by Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and his funding came from Beth Israel Research Hospital, which is a research wing of the Mossad.
So I've heard it proposed that you've seen a lot of Mossad agents leave the agency after a couple of years, start companies that are then used by both Mossad and the CIA. You know, how much separation or how much are the CIA and Mossad joined together?
That's a great question. I don't think there is a separation. So one example, it's not CIA, it's NSA. I think this is kind of something that happens frequently. NSA worked on Stuxnet with Israel and then whatever their Team 8200 or whatever they're called. It was mostly made by the NSA, though. Stuxnet was a virus designed specifically to infiltrate the air-gapped computers in Iran and basically fry their refinement systems. And it worked. It totally worked. It was brilliant. It was genius. But the NSA developed that, and they gave it to the Israelis with some parameters. This is the conditions under which you can use it, and they had some rules. And the Israelis just threw that shit right out the window, and they modified the virus, and they did everything they wanted to, and that's exactly what they do with everything we give them. We give them our fighter jets, and we give them military technology. And what do? They strip it down, and they sell it to the Chinese. You know, they're not an ally. They've never been an ally. They murdered our president. They're the most disgusting, vile nation state that's ever existed. I'd compare them to the Huns. So, did I answer the question?
I was curious to get on your opinion on do you think that Theodore Hertz had that original thing in mind, or do you think that the message has changed
Yes.
with the time? Because, for instance, I totally buy the idea. You know, Menachem Begin, he liked to bomb things.
Yeah.
He was completely not. He liked Jabotinsky and whatsoever.
Right.
But I could see the argument that's not what the guy wanted at the beginning, and then the message is
Right.
precipitated. So what do you think happened? Do you
Okay,
think that's
so-
a reasonable or no?
I would say that's reasonable. However, there are things that Herzl. See, Herzl was psychotic. He was crazy. He ended up dying in a mental institution at the age of 42. So he had communicated with another guy named Hirsch, who had set up a Jewish colony in Argentina, 15,000 strong. And he communicates back and forth with him, kind of feel him out and see how can we do this bigger. And in their communications, it's basically said, this is how you do it. You get a small colony, you get a foothold, whether you buy it or however through trade or whatever, and then you slowly, gradually expand until you take over the whole nation. So he talked about that specifically long before any Zionist activity was enacted. So you can say in one hand that it was not what it is today, but at the same time, there was underhandedness, and he wrote about everything being kept secret, right? So if something is good, why do you have to keep it a secret? The Diaries of Herzl is a fascinating read. It's a glimpse into the mind of a madman. And his basic principles are what are being enacted today, for the most part. I would say that the people who are Zionists today hide behind a Jewish front, and they're not. They're just not. Zionism's contradictory to the Orthodox texts. You know, that's why 10% of Jews, the Orthodox, despise the Zionists, you know? It's a bastardization of an ideology that really was founded on discrimination in the first place. So.
Maybe you're going to come to this, but I've been to Dealey Plaza, and having seen the documentary Everything's a Rich Man's Trick.
I know the guy who made that, the nicest guy in the world.
Okay. And looking at the storm drain, where purportedly there was a rifleman,
Right.
hearing that the limousine driver actually stopped, which the CIA cut out of the Zapruder film. And then there was a Japanese, apparently, film clip of the driver, who supposedly was an LBJ guy, turning and firing over his shoulder.
William Greer.
Okay. And I'm just curious, like, would you say that those were the kill shots?
Absolutely not.
No.
So,
All right, thank you.
that I know exactly what you're talking about. That what appears to be him turning around and shooting the president is just bad film. He's turning around and looking, because another thing that it does is it detracts from what he really did. Okay? And what I'm about to say right now is probably the most controversial thing in as far as like other Kennedy researchers when they look at my work and tell me I'm full of shit. If you study two photographs in particular, McIntyre #1 and McIntyre #2, McIntyre #1 is just as the limousine passes under the overpass, and you can see the limo coming straight at you this way, okay?
This is after the shot.
After the shots, right? The second one, McIntyre 2, it is turning off onto the Stemmons Freeway, and you can see it kind of from the side. So it's the same photographer, one this way and one like right there. Now, when you really study that photograph, McIntyre #1, what it appears to me, and everyone who I show this to, demonstrate the picture to them, they all end up agreeing with me. I might be crazy, I might be wrong. It appears as though when you look at McIntyre #1, there is a man standing in the back of the president's limousine, and he's holding a rifle. And it is absolutely not Clint Hill. Clint Hill, who is the Secret Service agent who jumps onto the back of the limo and gets on top of Jackie. In this photograph, you can see clearly that his head is hanging over the right side of the limousine, the driver's side. So he's already on top of Jackie, and his head is hanging over, and you can see exactly where he would be in the third row. Also, at the exact same time, there's a man standing in that back seat wearing a black jacket, wearing a black sock hat, and there is his arms are like this, and there is a solid line going at a 45-degree angle that to me looks like a man holding a rifle. Now, why would they do this? Why would I conclude that they would do this? Because this event, for the people who were involved, was as much ritual as anything else. The shooter on the knoll who took off Kennedy's head was Jack Valente, who was the right-hand man of Lyndon Johnson going back to 1956. But I do not believe Lyndon Johnson was involved at all. And it sounds contradictory, I know. But the reason for that is that you're going to want your next president to know anything at all if he can be questioned. And I don't think so at all. Lyndon Johnson was a puppet. He never won an election. He was put into every position he ever had. So, but Jack Valente, very important person, will go on to lead the Motion Picture Association of America. He created the movie rating system. And he was most certainly a diehard spook going back to his time, I would say, in the war, when he joined the war. Allegedly, he's a bomber pilot. I've done the most detailed research into his background and his training as a bomber pilot. I can't seem to debunk it at all, but at the exact same time, I know that he was referred to by Otto Skorzeny as having the aliases of Max and Zed. So I know that he had a hidden history at some point. There was one incident where he allegedly was in a crash and broke his arm. This happened at the same time, allegedly, that there was a assassination attempt by the CIA on Trujillo and the assassin's Jeep flipped. Proof? Absolutely not. Interesting? Absolutely. I have one document that proves that Jack Valenti worked for the CIA for his whole life. It is a memo that is meant to transfer Jack Valenti's payroll. And it basically says, we need to transfer his payroll from this federal agency onto the White House payroll. But the problem was, for the last 10 years, he'd been running Weekly and Valenti, which was a advertising, marketing kind of firm down in Houston. Now, what kind of federal agency could you possibly be working for, getting a paycheck while you're running a multi-million-dollar business in Houston? There's only one, the CIA. So
You're saying Valenti was the sniper on the grassy knoll?
yes, one of two. The shooter who fired the throat shot was David Ferry, straight from New Orleans. The shooters in the book depository, you have two on the 6th floor, Lawrence Howard, Lauren Hall. These guys are mercenaries. They run with a guy named William Seymour. And like I said, I cannot for the life of me, there's no evidence whatsoever that I have seen that puts Lee Harvey Oswald at the book depository on November 22nd. Oswald was being impersonated for months leading up to the assassination. He was impersonated at the shooting range. He was impersonated at the Lincoln Mercury dealer where he did a test drive of a vehicle. He's impersonated in dozens of places, oftentimes seen with a large husky Latino with a pockmarked face. Guy had moles on his face. Very unique description of a very rough character, Lawrence Howard. So when you go through the documents and you look at all the sightings of Oswald where he's accompanied by this large husky man, you really come to realize that it was never Oswald. It was this guy named William Seymour, who looked so much like Oswald that even Roger Craig, after having seen William Seymour, identified him as Lee Harvey Oswald. So,
What about Johnson's personal assassin?
okay, you're talking about Malcolm Wallace. That, I believe, is a little propaganda. If there was a personal assassin, it was Valenti. And I never put too much stock into the personal assassin story. He had a list of 8 men that were on the hit list. And I didn't really buy into any of it because there's a lot of propaganda out there. People like to take stories and just make them up and run with them. So I always kind of thought that was it. But in going through Jack Valenti's file, which is not associated with any of the Kennedy documents, it's its own standalone file, which is where you find all the good stuff, not in the Kennedy documents. In his file, after he left the White House in 1960, let me see, Johnson was still in, so it must have been like 66 or 67. He flies on an airplane, and he files a police report when he gets off that some things were stolen out of his luggage. And 2 of the items were cufflinks that were given to him by Lyndon Johnson. Or this is what it says in the police report, at least. It says the comment that these cufflinks were 5/8, meaning 5/8 of an inch, and 6/8, 6/8 of an inch. And both of them would be out of circulation because they contain the president's seal. Well, I did a whole bunch of research into these cufflinks, and they don't exist. None of those cufflinks were ever donned in inches. They were always millimeters. So the signal that he was sending had nothing to do with cufflinks. That's what I determined from that. And that's what got me thinking about 5 out of 8 and 6 out of 8 being on Johnson's out of 8 hit list. So whenever there's like a common theme or a common story, or everyone kind of accepts something happened within the Kennedy assassination, you can pretty much guarantee it didn't happen that way. And so the Malcolm Wallace story, to me, is pure propaganda. And I say if, there was a personal assassin, it was most certainly Jack Valenti, who is not the person that he went on to portray himself as for 40 years in the limelight in Hollywood. That's another thing. He never moved to Hollywood. He ran Hollywood from D.C., if that tells you anything. So,
Someone like Emilio Santana, would he have also just been a mercenary, or did he have a grudge against Kennedy?
they all had grudges against Kennedy.
Yeah.
All of them did. Everyone had their own reason.
Would it be correct to say he was also a mercenary?
100%.
Okay.
A lot of these guys, especially anti-Castro Cubans, they came to America, they had nothing to do. Some of these guys get out of the Marines, 59, 60, Lawrence Howard, and all these guys. They kind of had nothing to do. Why they didn't stay in the military, I don't know. I think it was probably too strictly regimented for them, and they wanted more freedom to go blow stuff up, because they all ended up kind of consolidating around No Name Key, and that's kind of where they all kind of got together through Interpen and the various other groups that were assembled by the CIA. So.
Thank you. This is fascinating. Going back to the propaganda machine, what would you say are your biggest insights about how the media has been manipulated?
Oh, well, the media has been owned since like 56 or something like that. When you go back and you start to research all the big names in media going back through the 50s, 60s, 70s, they're all compromised. So I don't see anything. I see today's media as like what we interpreted as like what Pravda was to the Soviets in the 70s and 80s. That's what to me modern news is. That's why the independent media is rising. That's why there are so many people getting their information from YouTube and X and places like that, as opposed to watching MSNBC, which has, I got friends who have shows that have bigger ratings than MSNBC. You know what I mean? It's like, what are you talking about here? You know? So yeah, the propaganda, really, if you want to understand the propaganda, you got to go back to World War II. That's where it all started for America anyway. The Office of Strategic Services was a propaganda machine, and they basically wrote the book on how to do propaganda. There's actually a document called The Doctrine Regarding Rumors, written by a guy named R.H. Knapp in May of '42. It is the playbook for all propaganda. I mean, if you were to look at it and read it and watch the news, you'd be like, oh, okay, it's the exact same thing. The study of propaganda, actually, I did a show for a long time called Understanding Propaganda, because propaganda is probably one of the more important concepts, and propaganda is really only half of what comprises psychological warfare. Really, we live in a constant state of battle, and the war field is psychological, and it's all being done to us on purpose. And when you go back and you read the old World War II doctrines on how to construct a rumor, you know, how to create terror propaganda, when you come to understand all of these various writings by our own government, you come to realize that they can't change the playbook, because we only absorb information as humans in so many ways. So there's not really much variance that they can do. So everybody should learn the playbook to know exactly when you're being bullshitted and when you're not.
Can you go ahead and outline what the official case against Lee Harvey Oswald was as being built by the police, and why you have direct issues with placing him at the hotel at all?
Oh, yeah, sure. Lee Harvey Oswald. They started crafting Lee Harvey Oswald all the way back in, 1945, I'd say. So this is what my new book is on. It's on the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother and his aunt and his two cousins on his mom's side were all involved with naval intelligence, and they were all involved in what is called an identity transfer operation. And I believe the vast majority of what they're hiding in regards to Kennedy is not about the assassination itself, but it's about Oswald and the operations that were going on way before the assassination. Oswald was repurposed, fundamentally. So Oswald, I'll try to make this brief, but going back to '45, Oswald went to Boston with his mother and with his stepfather, Edwin Ekdahl. They're there for about 6 months. This is confirmed by Robert Oswald, testified to this to the Warren Commission. We have documentary evidence that Oswald was going to school in Benbrook, Texas, starting October 31st through February 13th of 1946. So obviously you can't be in two places at once. You can't be in Boston living there, and you can't be at Benbrook Common School at the exact same time. Well, what I just explained is the first of dozens of contradictory information over the life of Lee Harvey Oswald. And after a while, it becomes really clear, based on not only the documentary evidence, the photographic evidence, witness statements, people who knew everyone involved at the time. There were fundamentally two Lee Harvey Oswalds. And I believe that they were brothers, and I believe they were separated shortly after birth. And sometime around 1941, when Oswald would have been about 2 years old, he is handed off to his aunt, Lillian Moret, in New Orleans. And his mother, Marguerite Oswald, disappears for 3 years. No trace of her at all. The story on where she is completely bunk. The addresses she gives, the job she had, all fall apart. Turns out she ended up in New York. The exact dates I'm unsure of. But she ended up joining the Navy WAVES program. The WAVES program was the Women in the Navy program. And so when all the men went off to war, they were left with a lot to do here and nobody to fill those roles. So they expanded the Navy's recruitment to women specifically, and the WAVES program was born. The addresses that Marguerite Oswald gives, where she was living at the time in New Orleans, they don't match any record. They don't exist, basically. The addresses aren't any good. But those addresses, if you change them to a Manhattan address, are right up the road from the WAVES training program at Hunter College in the Bronx. So what do we have? We have clear-cut evidence of Marguerite Oswald joining the Navy. She admitted in her book, A Woman in Time, or A Woman in History, that she was in the Navy as a phone operator. So we have her disappearing for 3 years. And then she comes back. And right about this time, she marries a guy named Edwin Ekdahl, who worked for Ebasco, which was an intelligence contractor. They built power stations in the Soviet Union at a time when we didn't have dealings with the Soviet Union. So it's kind of weird. He was connected to a guy named Fred Korth. Fred Korth was his lawyer when he divorced Marguerite Oswald, but Fred Korth would actually go on to be Secretary of the Navy. Big shot in naval intelligence. And he seems to be connected to a string of addresses that the Oswalds will be connected to between 47 and 63, actually. So the person who was Lee Harvey Oswald, there's conflicting information over, was he a communist? Was he an agent? Did he speak Russian? What's the deal? And these are all questions that I still don't really have answers to. What I can tell you is that nobody can put Oswald ever speaking Russian before he shows up at Santa Ana, California in the Marines in late December, early January of 1959. Not a single person can tell me that he spoke Russian, because he didn't. Then when Lee Harvey Oswald goes to Russia, did you know he never spoke Russian one time when he went there? All of his friends there spoke English. Never spoke Russian, okay? Then he comes back and allegedly he's fluent in Russian again. So there's something going on here, right? There's conflicting stories on whether or not he was in New York, New Orleans, or even North Dakota for a time. He told Eileen Mosby, a reporter, when he was in Moscow, that he discovered Das Kapital by Marx in a library in North Dakota. The official story swears he never went to North Dakota. This is at a time he's attending PS 44 in Manhattan. Or is it PS 44 in the Bronx? Because we've been told both things. So when you really get into the life of Lee Harvey Oswald, he was a construct from day one. Everything that you know about Oswald was a carefully constructed fiction that I'm working my way through right now. So I hope I answered your question.
So it's kind of broader to like what you're saying about the Israel sort of as the linchpin of this whole thing. And I've been working with the theory for a long time that the impetus for World War II overall was the establishment of the nation state of Israel.
100%.
Right. And so maybe if there's any way you can
World War
unpack
I as
that,
well.
but I would agree with that. And then to touch on what you're saying about these events, and I agree with you, JFK, and I would say 9/11, COVID all have the components of a ritual that links back to Zionism as ultimately sort of an apocalyptic cult. Like there has to be a theology for ritual, right?
Right. So the Zionist thing is weird because some of them are atheists. More of them are likely occultists, but none of them are like traditional Orthodox Jews, right? So I am still rather conflicted on whether or not these people actually believe their own bullshit. You know what I mean? I don't know. Because when you look at what they do, when you look at how they implement the ritual aspect to things, which they most certainly did, there were rabbis in Dealey Plaza wearing Purim ceremonial outfits that day, captured clearly in the Robert Hughes film, the untampered Robert Hughes film. I got to wonder why. Why do they do this? And I believe it's to maintain the religiosity of it, all right? The reason they don't, like, they do all that weird shit on the weekends and they don't touch doorknobs and stuff, but they get a machine to turn, you know, like they're going to trick God. You know what I mean? Maintaining the religiosity is very important for some reason. Because God's stupid and he don't know better, right? So I think, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
It helps reaffirm.
Like Netanyahu, the king Zionist of them all, I don't know what the hell that guy really believes. That guy can't believe anything. That's it. Nothing in the Bible, I guarantee that.
Right.
So
there's so many to all these events, so much esoteric symbolism.
Right.
So I got to ask myself, like, are they true believers, or is this?
That's a question I ask myself all the time.
Sort of like evangelical, which is obviously linked to Zionism and that theology.
I think there's factions who believe the stuff, right? Like the costume people, as I call them, the ones who show up in the costumes at all the assassinations. Like, they are a different faction than the people who are given the orders. You know what I mean? I think it's kind of a multifaceted thing.
So the breadth of research that you've done on this is, okay, so with all of that, and also just being a human that thinks critically in this world, throughout the history of our country, do you believe that we've had a presidential assassination, either attempted or successful, that was not done by the state at its essence, or done by the elements that control our state, the ones in power?
I don't think so, because I don't think normal people think like that. You know? Even crazies don't go out around shooting presidents, you know? Maybe.
Going back to Oswald, pardon me, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Jack Ruby, because one of the things that makes the sort of, official version seem so suspicious is, okay, so we're supposed to believe that this gangster is so mad about the assassination of his president that he just decides to go ahead and shoot Oswald. So, but it also does kind of fit with the story that you're telling, is like, okay, that, gangsters were involved, and it's like, you can imagine, well, okay, well, you say, okay, hey, Jack Ruby, you need to off Oswald, because clearly you got to get rid of the fucking guy, because he's just a story, he's a front. Right. But I was wondering if you could just kind of riff a little bit on like what you think about that.
So a lot of people like to say that Jack Ruby and Oswald knew each other. I haven't seen any evidence of that whatsoever. What I have seen evidence of is that the men who were impersonating Oswald, William Seymour and Kerry Thornley, those two men in particular, they definitely knew Jack Ruby. So when I see reports of people saw Oswald at the Carousel Club with Jack Ruby, I'm like, no, it was most likely Kerry Thornley or William Seymour. There's one incident in particular I can say with certainty. Oswald's identified in the Carousel Club by a guy named Harvey Wade, and he was in town for a couple days on a business meeting, and he goes to the Carousel Club, and then he swears he saw Oswald there, but then he describes Oswald as having been with a large, husky Latin man who had pox on his face, so then clearly not Oswald, clearly William Seymour. I think that's the overwhelming pattern there. So November 22nd, Oswald is arrested out the front door of the Texas Theater. I am convinced he was supposed to die in that theater. I can't figure out what happened with the gun, but Oswald never ordered a gun. The gun that showed up was rejected at the post office, ended up at a place called Railroad Express, and then it was signed for by somebody named Paxton. I don't know who the hell that is, but it wasn't Oswald. So that gun in particular, allegedly Oswald pulls the gun, they struggle over it, he gets beat up, they drag him out the front. I found a police document that says at some point that gun ended up on the floor. So that's a pretty fascinating thing to me. After this incident at the Texas Theater, Oswald's arrested. The very first phone call that Jack Ruby made was to a guy named Al Gruber. Al Gruber is in Los Angeles. Al Gruber was the right-hand man of Mickey Cohen. And who was stationed in Los Angeles? Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir. I believe it's that moment that Al Gruber gave Jack Ruby the order to kill Oswald. Everyone who interacted with Jack Ruby after that phone call said he wasn't himself or he was pale as a ghost. And why would they give him the order to kill Oswald? Well, Oswald had to go, obviously. But Jack Ruby had cancer. He had cancer going back, some people say, till the time he was living in Chicago, which would have been like 47, 48, which is crazy. But there was numerous documents showing that he had cancer at least as late as 62 or 63, long before he died. Because then, people try to say he got injected with CIA super cancer or something retarded like that. Yeah. If it sounds ridiculous, it probably is. They do have the heart attack gun, and I'm sure they got a whole lot more than that too. David Ferry died of natural causes, or they think, they're not sure how David Ferry died. 2 suicide notes. The guy was perfectly healthy, but then he turns up dead. Who knows? So yeah, in the modern era, they could probably kill you with satellites from space. I'm sure. Any more questions?
We're gonna do maybe 3 or 4 more.
Sure.
Yeah, with regards to Israel and getting back to foreign policy, what's the reasons that our foreign policy and propaganda media is so against Iran and Russia?
That's a good question, and I have my opinions. I can't say my opinions are 100% correct, but I can tell you this. The original Jewish homeland is not in Palestine. It's in eastern Ukraine. The Donbass region that Russia just annexed, that is the birthplace of Ashkenazi Jews. There wasn't a white Jew on planet Earth till about 800, 750, something like that. And that's where they came from. They will be driven out of that land around 1200 to 1220 AD. And that's when you see the first signs of Ashkenazi Jews in Poland and in Germany. So I believe it's a 1,000-year-old grudge. That's just me. That's how these people think. So that, and Iran, well, Iran is the only other thing standing in the way of the Greater Israel Project. That's why we went into Iraq. You know, that's why they're still bombing Syria. And Iran's a problem because Iran could kick both of our asses, Israel and America. We couldn't even blow up their nuclear facility, right? We go in there, we drop 3 or 4 of those bunker busters, didn't do shit, nothing. And they probably, I'm starting to, the more I think about it, the more I realize this is probably all theater. They were probably on the phone with each other. Hey, we're moving the stuff out. Okay, go ahead and bomb it. You know, it's wag the dog all over again.
Did the new declassified documents confirm or change your mind on anything, or you didn't find really, it's not?
No, the only things that I question is, so for my research, the only 2 people in New Orleans who ever had contact with Oswald were Kerry Thornley and Clay Shaw. And I say that because there's evidence of that. There's evidence that those 2 people interacted with him directly. Outside of that, I have no evidence that he had any involvement with any of the other activities going on in New Orleans, but we keep seeing documents where witnesses are seeing Oswald involved in some of these activities with guys like Guy Bannister and David Ferry and all the guys who were hanging out at 544 Camp Street. So it makes me want to go back and reanalyze some of this stuff to determine who it is they're talking about. Because Kerry Thornley was impersonating Oswald all over New Orleans. He's the one who had the Fair Play for Cuba Committee flyers printed at Jones Printing. Douglas Jones identified 4 pictures of Kerry Thornley to Harold Weisberg, a researcher, when he asked him who had the flyers printed, right? So the flyers for Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans, that's supposed to be like the slam dunk evidence that Oswald was a communist, you know? So I'm interested in reevaluating all the New Orleans stuff, particularly in July and August of '63. But other than that, not really. They like to flood us with documents on Cuba. There's a lot of mystique around Cuba. And so Oswald allegedly goes to Mexico City, September 26th, 27th of '63. But it wasn't Oswald, it was Kerry Thornley. He was being impersonated there. They were setting him up. They were leaving an additional trail. They were trying to say, see, he's still a communist. He's trying to get into Cuba, right? That's the whole point of that trip. But you see, they screw up and they release documents that show us that Oswald was definitely still in New Orleans on September 26th when he's supposed to be in Mexico City, where he is actually closing out his P.O. box and leaving a forwarding address to the Payne's residence in Fort Worth, right? So we have clear evidence that he was in New Orleans when the story says he was in Mexico City, right? So detangling all of the mess that they've made with Oswald and where he was and things that he said, and you know, anytime Oswald's out there talking about communism after he gets back from the Soviet Union, and he gets back from the Soviet Union, and he's like, man, that place sucked. He's like, communism sucks. That place sucks. I don't want nothing to do with that, right? And the next thing you know, he's back on the street corner handing out communist flyers. Doesn't make any sense, right? This is all agitation. He was an agitator at the time. But see, for me, the setup had to have been late '62, early '63. The first documented piece of the setup came when they ordered the rifle, because he never ordered that stupid rifle. That piece of junk rifle was imported by Adams Consolidated, a CIA company. And it came in a lot of like 70 of them. There were at least 3 of those Carcanos floating around New Orleans at the time. But yeah, it was a complete piece of junk. He never ordered it. And the money order that was used, the money order they present to us saying that he used to buy it, is a complete forgery. It's a fake. And we know this because the original money orders back in '62, '63, they were done on hard card stock. But yet we have ink bleed through on the image that they tell us was the money order that he used to order the rifle. You can't have ink bleed through on card stock. It just doesn't happen. So a huge portion of the documents that we have surrounding the ordering of the rifle, the handgun, a whole bunch of other stuff, all came from one particular lawyer who worked for the FBI, and we don't have the originals. All we have are photocopies, and that's it. So anything that they tell us is real, that they don't have the original piece of evidence and all they have is a photocopy, you can guarantee is a fake. And unfortunately, that applies to about half of Oswald's life leading up to his time in the Marines in '56. Fake documents, faked addresses, forged signatures, all kinds of stuff. So.
This might be a big topic, but as a summary, what do we know about the Israeli connections to the Korean War and Vietnam generally?
Well, generally speaking, Vietnam and the LBJ connection. Korea, I'll get back to you on that one. I've covered that a little bit before, but yeah, that one's pretty. It's always, the evidence is always sketchy on the surface, but as soon as you dig into it, you find out this weapons contractor had a deal with this guy over here, and his brother was in the Mossad, and that's how it goes.
General Dynamics and the Crown.
Oh yeah,
family.
General Dynamics. Yeah. All those General Dynamics is what, Boeing now?
I think yeah.
Yeah. All those corporations back then were in bed with the CIA, and the CIA was like, them and the Israelis were like that the whole time, for some reason. Everyone's loyal to Israel. I feel like I'm in some like bizarro universe. It's crazy.
Half comment, half question. Oswald was married to a Russian woman. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but I hesitate because she's not who she alleges to be either. She's the assassination happens, the FBI and everyone in the grandmother three-letter agency shows up, and she knows like 2 words of English. 4 months later, she's like completely fluent on the stand for the Warren Commission.
Okay.
What's going on with that? She's a liar. She was in on the setup of Oswald from day one. Her uncle was in the KGB, higher up in the KGB. Recently, it's kind of been alleged that he was a CIA double agent, and that's how he got them out of the country. But when you do a really thorough analysis of the photographs of that woman, they do not all look like the same woman. Hair color different, face different. And then when you start to compare her to other people involved in the story. So there's the concept of identity transfer or body doubles is a typical spy technique that they use all the time that we don't know anything about. And it sounds crazy when we start talking about it. But when you start to dig into the family of Oswald, you'll find some connections, especially appearance-wise, between a woman named Joyce Moret, who was a cousin of Oswald, and Ruth Payne. They are almost identical in 1963. And Joyce Moret was in Dallas at the time with her husband. So it leads me to believe a lot of the stories that we hear about certain people are not the people we're told they are. So,
yeah, and then LBJ's girlfriend has supposedly testified that he said the Kennedys will never.
I don't buy
bother me
anything
again.
that she says whatsoever.
Okay. And
So
then-
that whole story about the night before, you're talking about Madeline Brown, because he had another girlfriend named Matilda Krim also, who was a Israeli spy who slept in the White House when they blew up the Liberty. But Madeline Brown tells a story that the night before there was a huge party at the Murchison Mansion, and like J. Edgar Hoover was there, and everybody and their grandmother was there, and they all talked about killing Kennedy. And I don't have any evidence for that whatsoever. Okay. None. Actually, I can put Jack Valenti in Lyndon Johnson's hotel room at 11:30 at night on the 21st.
All right.
And so I really don't think that ever happened. It's too glamorous. Whenever you hear stuff that's too glamorous, it usually is.
Okay.
So.
And what about Poppy Bush?
Okay, so I believe Bush was in Dealey Plaza, although the photographs that people say are of Bush were not of Bush. But I know, I believe he was there. He contradicted himself every which way. But people think that he was like a big shot then. He wasn't. He was a guy the CIA went to for money. And that's all he had to offer them then, because he was rich. And Prescott Bush and the whole Bush clan, yeah, they're all dirty. So, but yeah, he was a nobody back then. He just gave them money. He didn't become anybody really till he took over in '73, I think it was. So, yeah, everybody knew. And that's another thing. When you start to really understand that everybody knew about Lee Harvey Oswald going back to the time he was a child, he had those files on him in every intelligence agency going back to the time like the 40s, right? So when you realize that, to me, it becomes pretty obvious that everybody knew about it. Everybody knew the assassination was going to happen. Everybody was involved in the cover-up. I mean, if you were to make a list, it'd be like 500 names long. Even Kennedy's best friends, you know, guys like Dave Powers and Kenny O'Donnell, who were in the Secret Service car, even them, I'm convinced 100% knew it was going to happen and then never said a word. I think that everyone really thought he was that much of a threat to the establishment as a whole. But really, the establishment as a whole was 50% Israel, you know, so.
2 more questions.
Hey, question that I heard some audio of LBJ and right after the assassination, he said something like, "Oh, damn it, they got him." Is that audio real, and who is they?
I'm not sure which one you're talking about. I know that there is there's an audio tape conversation between him and Senator Russell, and they're talking about the shots, and Russell makes a statement. He goes, if there's a guy who can shoot Kennedy in the throat and then take his head clean off in the next shot and not even shoot his wife who's right next to him, well, I don't believe there was a single shooter. You know, how's he gonna miss the car and even miss the street? He's like, I don't buy it for a split second. And then Lyndon Johnson agrees with him. He says, yeah, I don't buy it either. That's a legit phone call that did happen. It was actually featured in a couple of documentaries recently. But no, everyone knew, but everyone had to cover it up. And why did they have to cover it up? For the same reasons they're covering up the Jeffrey Epstein stuff, because all roads lead to the same place.
Hey, awesome talk, Cory. Really appreciate you. All the research, all the knowledge, everything, and coming down here to do this talk.
Thank you.
You talked about, after they killed MLK, RFK, that was kind of the end of the resistance. Like the country was over at that point, totally co-opted. Have you seen in your research any other figures that maybe were part of this resistance or presented any other type of significant threats after MLK and RFK that maybe you've caught?
Jim Trafficant, and they murdered him. So, no, not really. It's been pretty smooth sailing for them ever since. I think once they killed Kennedy, which was the biggest event in world history, well, modern world history, they felt emboldened. I mean, when you go and you look at how they pulled off RFK, I'm not an expert on RFK, but it's pretty simple to know what happened there. Thane Eugene Caesar was the security guard. Thane Eugene Caesar was right next to Robert Kennedy. And Robert Kennedy was shot within 3 inches on the back of his head, as per the autopsy. And so they tried to destroy the guy who did the autopsy. I forget his name. It was a Japanese guy. He's hailed as like one of the best of what he did. He did the autopsy, and they all shit on the guy. They're like, no, he was shot from the front. Of course, he wasn't shot from the front. But no, that and Martin Luther King is interesting to me because I have my suspicions on who actually really pulled that trigger. So I'll just say this. At the time that Martin Luther King was killed, Jack Valenti was traveling to destinations unknown. And that very same day, he had an article come out that he had published in the newspaper about how sad of a day it was. What a great cover story. And then this you'll never find in any book, but you'll find it in a newspaper article. Right after the assassination of Martin Luther King, a short, balding white man was picked up by the FBI, driven to a federal building, and that's all we know about it. That short, balding white man was either Raul, who was the guy named Vincent Calderon Jr., or Jack Valenti, in my opinion, because Vincent Calderon Jr., who's the real Raul, and the short tramp in Dealey Plaza, is the former brother-in-law of Jack Valenti. And if you ask me, assassins, their spotters are lifelong. They stick with the same guy forever. So, but that's pure speculation on my part, and I'll admit it. So,
That's our talk. Give it up for Cory.